Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to Reading Thucydides Peloponnesian War. We're using the Crawley translation that's available in Landmark Thucydides. If you want to get the book, you've been following it through that. There's other translations that are some ways better, some like this. Um, but we're using Landmark because of the accessibility through Google Books that has a copy of this, and it's there. Um, and it's I'm using this because that way you can read what I'm doing, and so therefore you can see what's going on a little bit and follow us what's going through here. Um, um, Today we're finishing the second part of the summer of the 17th year. We began this is about the preparation debate about whether Athens should go and engage in the Sicilian enterprise, the capture of Sicily. And we remember that it was originally a kind of a daring plan by Alcibiades, using kind of a smaller engagement, trying to go in and help an ally. Um, Nicias didn't like it. He thought it was too dangerous. He kind of talked him out by giving the costs and showing that it's not really an interest. But Alcibiades was able to defend his position there, and make an argument for doing this, and that this would, it, that doing it the way that it did. What Nicias hoped to do was to scare them off by making it, making a bigger endeavor, sending a larger force, making it that there's no way it can lose. But he oversold it, and to the point where his hope was to scare the Athenians off from doing it. Instead, it made it said, "Oh, this can't lose, and therefore we might as well do it." And everyone wanted to become part of it. And and then what happened was the sacrilege with the statues, and the enemies of Alcibiades used the destruction of the Hermes and other events to kind of destroy him politically. They didn't want to try him now, which Alcibiades wanted to try him now, because they feared that the soldiers would support him. So what they did was they wanted to send him away and then come get him later. We used him. Okay, but we're going to start off where we ended, which is chapter 30. We ended chapter 29 where he talks about they ordered him to sail, and now this is what's going on. After this, a departure for Sicily took place. This is chapter 30. It now being midsummer, most of the allies with grain transports and the smaller craft and the rest of the expedition had already received orders to assemble at Caria and to cross over the Ionian Sea. From there, the body of the Epigaean Permone. But the Athenians themselves, and such of their allies as happened to be with them, went down to the Piraeus upon the day appointed at daybreak, and began to man the ships to be put out at sea. With them went the whole population, one may say, of the city, both citizens and foreigners, inhabitants of the country, which escorting those belonged to them, their friends, their relatives, or their sons, with the hope of the lamentations on their way, as they thought of the conquest as which they hoped to make, or the friends whom they might never see again, considering the long voyage which they were going to make for their country. Indeed, this is chapter 31. When he goes, indeed, at this moment, when they were now upon the point of parting one from one another, the danger came home to them more than they had when they had voted for the expedition. Although the strength of the armament and the profuse provisions which they observed in every department, with a sight that could not comfort them. As for the foreigners and the rest of the crowd, they simply went to see a sight worth looking at and passing all belief. Indeed, this armament that first sailed out was by far the most costly and splendid Hellenistic force that ever been put out by a single city up to that time. It in mere numbers of ships and hoplites that against Eperitus under Pericles, and the same fleet when it was going against Padilla under Hamagon was not inferior, containing as it did 4,000 Athenian hoplites, 300 horse, and 100 triremes, accompanied by 50 lesbian and Chilean vessels, and many allied besides. But these were sent upon a short voyage with scanty equipment. Well, the present expedition was formed in contemplation of a long term of service by land and sea alike, and was furnished with ships and troops as so to be ready for either as required. The fleet had been equipped so elaborately equipped as the cost of captains and the city, the treasury giving a drachma a day for each seaman, providing empty ships, 60 warships, and 40 transports, manning with the best crews attainable, while the captains gave a bounty in addition to the pay of the treasury to the Thenani and crews of general, besides spending lavishly on figureheads and equipment, one and all making the utmost exertions to enable his ship to excel in beauty and fast sailing. Meanwhile, the land forces, which had been picked from the best enrollment rolls, and vied with each other in addition to their arms and personal accoutrement. From this resulted not only a rivalry among themselves and their other departments, but an idea among the rest of the Hellenists that it was more a display of power and resource than of an armament against the enemy. For if anyone had counted up the public expenditure of the city and the private outlays of individuals, that is to say, the sums which the city had already spent upon the expedition and was sending out in the hands of the generals, and those sums which individuals had expected upon their personal outfit, or captains and trimanes had laid out and were still to lay out on their vessels. And if had added this to the journey money which each likely would to provide himself with, independently of the pay from the treasury, for a voyage of this length, and what the soldiers or traders took with them for the purpose of exchange, it would have been found that many talents in all were being taken out of the city. Indeed, the expedition became not less famous for its wonderful boldness than for the splendor of its appearance, than for the overwhelming strength of as compared with the peoples against whom it was directed, and for the fact that this was the longest passage from home hitherto attempted, and the most ambitious of the objects considered of resources to those who undertook it. Now, this is chapter 32. The ships now being manned and everything put on board with them was meant to sail, and trumpet to command silence, and prayer ceremonies were put out to sea were offered, not to each ship by itself, but to all together, to a voice of a herald, and bowls of wine mixed through all the armaments, and libations were made by all the sailors and their officers in gold and silver goblets. They were all joined in the prayers by the crowd on the shore and by citizens of all and all others who wished them well. The hymns sung and the libations furnished as they put out to sea, the first sailing out in columns when they raced each other as far as Aegina and hastened to the Croatia, where the rest of the allied forces were assembling. Meanwhile, at Syracuse, news of the expedition came in from many quarters, but for a long while met with no credence whatsoever. Indeed, an assembly was held, which speakers, it will be seen, were delivered by different orators, believing or contradicting the reports of Athenian expedition, among whom Hermocrates, son of Hermon, came forward, being persuaded that he knew the truth of the matter, and gave the following counsel. Although I am persuaded I shall be perhaps no better believed than others have been when I speak about the reality of the expedition. And although I know that those who either make or repeat statements through not worthy of belief only not only gain no conference, but also thought fools of their pains, I shall certainly not be frightened into holding my tongue when the city is in danger, and I am persuaded that I can speak with more authority on the matter than other persons. Much of you wonder at it. The Athenians, nevertheless, have set out against us with a large force, naval and military, professedly to help the Erigaians to restore Renoni, but really to conquer Sicily, and above all our city. Which once gained, the rest they think will easily follow. Make up your minds, therefore, to see them speedily here, and see you can best repel them with the means at hand. Do not be taken off guard through scorning the news, and neglect common good through disbelieving it. Meanwhile, those who believe me need not be dismayed at the force or the daring of the enemy. They will not be able to do us more hurt than we shall do them, nor is the greatest of their armaments altogether without advantage to us. Indeed, the greater it is, the better, with regard to the rest of the Sicilians, who, dismayed, will make more ready to join us. And if we defeat or drive them away, having failed in their ambition, for which I do not fear for a moment that they will get what they want, it will be more glorious exploit for us, and in my judgment, no means unlikely an unlikely one. Few individuals have been, few indeed have been the large armaments, either Hellenistic or barbarian, have gone far from their home and been successful. They cannot be more numerous than the people of the country and their neighbors, whom fear unites. And if they fail for want of supplies in a foreign land, to those against whom their plans were laid, they nevertheless leave renown, although they may themselves have been the main cause for their own discomfort. Thus, these very Athenians, roused by the defeat of the Persians, in great measures due to accidental causes, from the mere fact that the Athenians had been the object of his attack. And this may very well be the cause with us also. Let us therefore confidently begin preparations here. Let us send to and confirm the support some of the Sicilians, and obtain friendships and alliance of others, and to dispatch envoys to the rest of Sicily to show that the danger is common to all, and to Italy to get them to become our allies, even or at events refuse to receive Athenians. I do not think that it would be best to send to Carthage. I also think it would be best to send to Carthage as well. They are no means without apprehension here, for it is their constant fear that the Athenians may one day attack their city, and they may perhaps think that they might themselves suffer by letting Sicily be sacrificed, and be willing to help us secretly, if not openly, in one way, if not in another. They are the best able to do so, if they will, or any of the present of any of the present day. They possess more gold and silver, by which war, like everything else, flourishes. Let us also send to Sparta and Corinth, and ask them to come here and help us as soon as possible, and to keep alive the war in Hellas. But in my opinion, the most important thing to do is to, at the present moment, is what you in your constitution love, that with your constitutional love of quiet, the regime's love of quiet, will be slow to see that what must that what I must nevertheless mention. If we Sicilians all together, or at least as many as possible beside ourselves, would only launch our whole of our present navy with 2 months' provisions, and to meet the Athenians at Tantrum and Abatian Promontory, and fight them before fighting for Sicily. They must fight for their passage across the Ionian Sea. We would strike dismay into their army, and make them realize that we have a base for our defense. For Tantium is ready to receive us, while they have a wide sea to cross with all their armaments, which could, with difficulty, keep its order through a long voyage. and it would be easy for us to attack as it came on slowly and in small detachments. On the other hand, if they were to lighten their vessels and draw together their fast sailors and attack us with these, we could either fall upon them when they were worried or rowing, or if we chose to retire to Tretium, while they, having crossed with few provisions just to give battle, would have difficult time in desolate places, and would either have to remain and be blockaded, or try to sail along the coast, abandoning the rest of their armament, and being further discouraged by not knowing a certain for whether the cities would receive them. In my opinion, this consideration alone would be sufficient to deter them from putting out from Croatia. And what is deliberate, and what with liberating and reconnoitering our number, whereabout they would let the season go until winter was upon them, or confounded by their unexpected by circumstance, would break up an expedition, especially as their most experienced generals has, as I hear, taken the command against his will, and would grasp at the first excuse offered by any serious demonstration of ours. We would also be reported, I am certain, as more numerous than we really are, and that men's minds are affected by what they hear. Besides, the first attack, or to show what they mean to defend themselves against attack, inspire great fear, because men see they are ready see that they are ready for an emergency. This would precisely this would be precisely the case with the Athenians at present. They are now attacking us in the belief that we shall not resist, having a right to judge us severely because we did not help the Spartans to destroy them. But if they were to see us showing a courage for which they are not prepared, they would be more dismayed by surprise than they could ever be by our actual power. I wish, I could wish to persuade you to show you this courage, but this cannot be at all evident. Be at all evident, loose, at not a moment, no, but at all evident, at all evidence. But if this cannot be at all evidence, loose, not a moment in preparing generally for the war. And remember, all of you that can. And remember, all of you, that contempt for an assailant is best shown by bravery in action. But what for the present the best course is to accept the preparations with fear, inspire, giving the surest promise of safety, and to act if the danger was real. That the Athenians are coming to attack us and are already upon the voyage, and all but here. This is what I'm sure of. Thus spoke Hermocrates. 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 Meanwhile, the people of the Syracusa were in a great strife among themselves. Some contending that the Athenians had no idea of coming, and that there was no truth in what he said. Some asked if they did come, what harm could they do would not be repaid them tenfold in return, while others made light of the whole affair and turned it into a ridicule. In short, there were few believed what Hermocrates had and feared for the future. Meanwhile, Athenagoras, the leader of the people and very powerful at the time, with the masses, came forward and spoke as follows. For the Athenians, he who does not wish that they may be as misguided as they are supposed to be, and that they come here to become our subjects, is either a coward or a traitor to his country. While as those who carry such timid tidings and you fill with so much alarm, I wonder less at their audacity than their folly if they flatter themselves that we do not see through them. The fact is that they have their private reasons to be afraid and wish to throw the city into consternation, to have their own terrors cast into the shade by public alarm. In short, this is what these reports are worth. They do not arise from themselves, but are concocted by men who are always causing agitation here in the Sicily. However, if you are well advised, you will not be guided by your calculations of probabilities, but by what these persons tell you, but by what shrewd men and of large experience, as I esteem the Athenians to be, likely would be likely to do. Now, it is not likely that they would leave the Peloponnesians behind them, and before they have well ended the war in Hellenes wantonly come in quest of a new war quite as arduous in Sicily. Indeed, in my judgment, they are too glad that we do not go and attack them, being so many and so great cities as we are. However, if they should come as reported, I consider Sicily better able to go through with the war than the Peloponnesians, being at all points better prepared, and now the city by itself far more than a match for this alleged invasion army, even if it were twice as large as large again. I know that they will not have horses with them, or will get any here, except a few perhaps from the Augustans, or be able to bring a force of hoplites equal in number to our own, in ships which will already have enough to do to come at this distance, however lightly laden. Do not speak of transports or other stores required against the city of this magnitude, which will be no which will be no slight quantity. In fact, so strong is my opinion about the subject, I do not well see how they could avoid annihilation if they brought them with them another city as large as Syracuse and settled down and carried on a war from our frontiers. Much less uh, 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 can they hope to succeed with Sicily hostile to them, as all Sicily would be, and with only a camp pitched from ships and composed of tents and bare necessities, from which they would not be able to stir far from our cavalry. But the Athenians will see this as I tell you, and I have reason to know we are looking after their possessions at home, while persons here invent stories that neither are true nor will ever be. Nor for this is the first time that I see such persons when they cannot resort to deeds trying by such stories and by others even more abominable to frighten the people and themselves to take over the government. It is what I this is it is what I see always, and I cannot help fearing that trying to so often they may one day succeed, and we, as long as we do not suffer, may prove too weak for the purpose weak for the task of prevention, or when the offenders are known of pursuit. The result is our city is rarely at rest, but is subject to constant troubles and conflicts as frequent against herself as against the enemy. Not to speak of occasional tyrannies and other infamous forms of government. However, I will try, if you will support me, to let nothing of this happen in our time, by winning over you and the many, and by the chastening of authors of such machinations, not merely when they are caught in such an act, a difficult feat to accomplish, but also for when they have the wish, through not, though not the power to, in as in necessary to punish an enemy, not only for what he does, but also beforehand for when he intends to do it. If the first to relax precaution would not be the first to suffer, I shall also reprove, watch, and on occasion warn the few, the most effective way, in my opinion, of turning them from the evil courses. And after all, I have often asked, what would you have? What would you have, young men? Would you hold office immediately? Would you hold office immediately? The law forbids it, and the law exacted rather because you are not competent, than to disgrace you when competent. Meanwhile, you wish not to be on legal equity with the many. But how can it be right that the citizen of the same city should be held unworthy of the same privilege? It will be said, perhaps, that democracy is neither wise nor equitable, but that the holders of property are the best fitted to rule. I say, on the contrary, first, that the word demos, or people, include the whole city, oligarch only a part, and next, that if the best guardians of property are rich, and the counselors of the wise, none can hear and decide so well as the many, and that all these talents, individually and collectively, have their just place in democracy. But an oligarchy gives the many their share of the danger, but not content with the largest part, takes and keeps the whole for the profits. And this is what the powerful and the young among you aspire to. But in a great in a great city cannot possibly obtain. But even now, foolish men, most senseless of all of the Hellenes that I know, if you have no sense of the wickedness of your design, or the or most criminal of you have have that sense, and yet still dare to pursue them, even now, if it is not, this is not chapter 40, right? If it's not now the case for repentance, you may still learn wisdom and thus advance the interest of your country, the common interest of us all. Reflect that in the country's prosperity, the men of merit in your ranks will have a share, and a large share, than the greatest masses of your fellow countrymen. But that if you have other designs, you run a risk of being deprived of all, and cease to spread these reports as these, as the people realize your purpose and will not put up with it. If the Athenians arrive, the city will repulse them in a manner worthy of itself. If we have generals who will see to this matter. If nothing of this is true, as I am inclined to believe, the city will not be thrown into panic by your reports, or imposed upon itself a voluntary servitude by choosing you for its ruler. The city itself will look into the matter and will judge your words as if they were acts, and instead of allowing itself be deprived of its liberty by listening to you, will serve to preserve that liberty by taking care to have already at hand the means of making itself respected. These are the words of Athenagoras. One of the generals now stood up and stopped any other speaker from coming forward, adding these words to his own with reference to the matter. It is not well for the speakers to utter calumnies against one another, for their hearers are to entertain. We ought rather to look to the information that we have received, and to see how each man by himself and the city as a whole may best prepare to repel the invaders. Even if there shall be no need, there is no harm in the city being furnished with horses and arms and all other accoutrements of war. And we undertake to see that to and order this, and to send round to the cities to reconnoiter, and to do what else may appear desirable. Part of this we have already seen already to, and whatever we shall decide shall be laid before you. After these words from the general, the Syracusans departed from the assembly. And in the meantime, the Athenians and all their allies now arrived at Caria. Here it is the generals began by again reviewing their armaments, and made arrangements as the orders in which they were to anchor and encamp. and dividing the whole fleet into three divisions, allotment to each one of their numbers to avoid sailing altogether and thus lacking sufficient water or provision at the station where they might land, and at some time be generally better ordered and easily to handle, by each squadron having its own commander. Next, they set up three ships ahead to Italy and Sicily to find out which of the cities should receive them, with instructions to meet them on the way and let them know before they'd put to land. After this, the Athenians sailed from Croatia and proceeded to sail across Sicily with an armament now consisting of 134 triremes in all, beside two Rhodesian pentacontes, of which 100 were Athenian vessels, 60 men of war, and 40 troop ships, and the remainder from Kalos and the other allies, 5,100 hoplites in all, of which 1,500 were Athenian citizens from the roles at Athens, and 700 Thestes ships as marines, and the rest allied troops, some of them Athenian subjects, and besides 500 Argives and 250 Manetians serving for hire, 480 archers in all, 80 of whom were Cretians. If 700 singers from Rose, 120 light armed exiles from Megria, and one horse transport carrying 30 horses. Such was the strength of the first armament that had sailed over for the war. The supplier for this force was carried by 30 merchant ships laden with grain, which conveyed with bakers, stonemasons, and carpenters, and crews for raising fortifications, accompanied 100 boats, like the former, conscripted into service, beside many other boats and merchant ships followed the armaments voluntarily for purposes of trade, all of which now left Croatia struck across the Aegean together. The whole force made land at the Apgania promontory and Tractrium with more or less good fortune. They then coasted along the shore of Italy, the cities shutting their markets and gates against them, and according them nothing but water and liberty to anchor. At Tractrium and Lorcae, not even that until they arrived at Rhegium, the extreme port of Italy. Here, at length, they reunited and had not gained admission within the walls, pitched a camp outside the city, Priestess Artemis, where a market was also provided for them, and drew their ships on shore and kept quiet. Meanwhile, they opened negotiations with the Rhegians and called upon them as Chaldaeans to assist their Leonine kinsmen, to which the Rhegians replied that they would not side with either party, but should await the decision of the rest of the Italians, and do as they did. Upon this, the Athenians now began to consider what would be best action to take in the affairs of Sicily, and meanwhile waited for the ships to be sent and come back from Aegeus in order to know whether there was really money mentioned by the messenger from Athens. In the meantime, reliable reports came from all quarters to the Sicilians, as well as those from their own officers sent to reconnoiter, that the fleet was at Rhegium, upon which they laid aside their incredulity and threw themselves ardently into work of preparation. They sent around guards and envoys, as might be, to the Sicils, put garrisons into the posts of Paropoli, in the country, and reviewed horses and arms in the city to see that nothing was wanting, and took all other steps to prepare for war, a war which might be going on at any moment. Meanwhile, three ships that had been sent ahead returned from Aegeus to the Athenians at Rhegium, with the news that far from there being sums promised, all that could be produced was 30 talents. The generals were not little disheartened at being disappointed at the outset, and the refusal of the Grimm to join in the expedition, they being the first people they tried to gain for reasons to count upon, from their relations to the Leonte and constant friendship of Athens, It was prepared from the news from Aegeus that his two colleagues were taken complete. In other words, if Nicias was prepared for the news from Aegeus, his two colleagues had been taken completely by surprise. The Aegeans had recourse to the following stratagem with the first Athenian envoys came to expect their resources. They took the envoys in quiet question to the temple of Aphrodite at X and showed them the treasure to spy there: bowls, wines, leisure, censer, and a large number of other objects being from being in silver and given the common impressions of wealth out of proportion to their really small value. They also privately entertained the ship's crew and collected all the cups of gold and silver they could find in Aegeus itself and could borrow in a neighboring Phoenician city of Helen and brought them to the banquets in their own, as all used pretty nearly the same, and everywhere a great quality of silver was shown, the effect of which was most dazzling upon the Athenian sailors, and made them talk loudly of the riches they have seen when they got back to Athens. The dupes in question, who had in their turn persuaded the rest, the much were much blamed by the soldiers when the news got abroad that there was not the money supposed at Aegea. Meanwhile, the generals discussed what was to be done. The option of Nicias was to sail with the common armaments to Sicros, the main objective of the expedition, and Aegeus could provide the money for the whole force to, to make it, their plans accordingly, but if they could not, to require them to supply provisions for 60 ships that they had asked for, and to stay and settle matters between them and the Sins either by force or agreement, and then coast past the other cities after displaying the power of Athens, proving their zeal for their friends and allies, to set sail home again, unless they should have suddenly an unexpected opportunity of serving the Leonides or bringing over some other city, and not endanger the city by wasting its resources, its home resources. Alcibiades said that a great expedition like the present must not disgrace itself by going away without having accomplished anything. Heralds must be sent to all the cities except Selinus and Syracuse, and efforts must be made to make some of the Sicils revolt from the Syracusans, and to gain friendships with others in order to obtain grain and troops. The first of all, to win the Macedonians, who lay right in the passage and the entrance to Sicily, and would afford an excellent harbor for any base for the army. Thus, bringing over the cities and knowing who would be their allies, of the they might indeed attack Syracuse and Salamis, unless the latter came in terms with Aegeus and the former at least to oppose the restoration of Leontini. Lacemenus, on the other hand, said that they ought to sail straight to Syracuse and fight the battle at once under the walls of the city, while their people were still unprepared, and panic of the height. Was every armament was most terrible at first, if it was allowed to run without showing itself. Men's courage revealed, and if they saw appeared at the last almost indifferent. By attacking suddenly, while Syracuse still trembled at their coming, they would have at best chance of gaining a victory for themselves and striking into complete panic the enemy, by which the aspect of their numbers, which would never appear so considerate as the present, by anticipation come example, all above the immediate danger of the engagement, by their immediate danger of the engagement. They might also count upon surprise among many in the field outside, and incredulous of their coming, and at the moment that the enemy was carrying all his property, the army would not want for booty if settled its forces before the city. The rest of the Sicilians would thus be immediately less disposed to enter the alliance with the Syracusan, and would join the Athenians without waiting to see which was the stronger. They must make the Megria their naval station as the place to retreat to and a base from which to attack. It was an uninhabited place at no great distance from Syracuse, either by land or sea. Having spoken to this effect, Lamachus nevertheless gave his support to the opinion of Alcibiades. After this, Alcibiades sailed in his own vessel across to Messalina with the proposals of alliance, but met with no success, the inhabitants answering that they could not receive him within their walls, though they would provide him with a market outside. Upon this, he sailed back to Rhegium. Immediately upon his return, the generals manned and improvised 60 ships out of the fleet and coasted along Naxos, leaving the rest of the armament behind at Rhegium with one of their number. Received by the Naxians, they coasted on to Cantina, and being refused admittance by the inhabitants, there being a pro-Syracusan party in the city, went over the river to Taris. There they bivouacked, and the next day sailed in straight files to Syracuse, with all their ships except 10, in which sent on in front to sail into the great harbor to see if there was any fleet wants, and to proclaim by herald from shipphone that the Athenians had come to restore the Leonardo to their country as being their allies and kinsmen, and that such of them, therefore, as were Syracusan would leave it without fear and join their friends and benefactors, the Athenians. After making this proclamation regarding the city harbors, the feature of the country, which they would have to make their base of operation in this war, they sailed back to Catana. Chapter 51. An assembly being held there, the inhabitants refused to receive the armament, but invited the generals to come in and say what they desired. And while Alcibiades speaking, the citizens were intent on their assembly. The soldiers broke down a badly walled up postern gate without being observed, and getting into the city, flocked into the marketplace. The Syracusan party in the city no sooner saw the army inside, they became frightened and withdrew, not being at all numerous. While the rest voted for an alliance with the Athenians, invited them to bring the rest of their forces from Rhegium. After this, the Athenians sailed to Rhegium and put off this time with all the armaments from Catana, that they began to build a camp up immediately. Meanwhile, word was brought from Cantarina, that if they went there, the city would go over to them, and that the Syracusans were manning a fleet. The Athenians accordingly sailed along the shore with all their armaments, first to Syracuse, where they found no fleet being manned, and then along the coast of Canaria, where they stopped on the beach and sent a herald to the people, however, refused to receive them, saying that their oath bound them to receive only a single vessel from the Athenians, unless they themselves sent for more. Disappointed here, the Athenians sailed back again, after landing on and plundering a Syracusan territory, and losing some strangler from the light armed troops, although coming up through the coming up of the Syracusan horse, so got back to Catana. They found Scatamelina come from Athens for Alcibiades, with orders for him to sail home to answer the charges which the city brought against him. For certain other soldiers who with him were accused of sacrilege in the matters of the mysteries and of the Herme. For the Athenians, after departing from the expedition, had continued an active as ever investigation in the fact of the mysteries and of the Hermes, and instead of testing the informers in their suspicions tempered, welcome all indifferently, arresting and imprisoning the best citizens among the real evidence of rascals, and preferring to sift the matter to the bottom sooner than to let an accused person of good character pass unquestioned, owing to the rascality of the informer. The people had heard how oppressive the tyranny of Presteris and his sons had become before it ended, and further that his tyranny had been put down at last not by themselves in Hamadas, but by the Spartans. And so they were always in fear and took everything suspiciously. Indeed, the daring actions of Aristo, Aristogoton and Hamadas was unmistaken in consequence of a love affair, which I shall relate at some length, to show that the Athenians are no more accurate than the rest of the world in their accounts of their own tyrants and of the fact of their own history. Pedastrius dying at an advanced age in possession of the tyranny was succeeded by his eldest son Hippias, not Hippocartus, as commonly believed. Harmodus was then in the flower of youthful beauty, and Aristogon, a citizen of the middle rank of life, was his lover and possessed him. Solicited without success by Hippocrates, son of Pistatras, Hermodus holds Aristogon, and the enraged lover, afraid that the powerful Hippocatus might take Hermodus by force, immediately formed a design such as his condition in life permitted for overthrowing the tyranny. In the meantime, Hippocrates, after a second solicitation of Harmodus, met with no better success and, willing to use violence, arranged to insult him in some covert way. Indeed, generally their government was not grievous to the multitude or in any way odious in practice. And these tyrants cultivated wisdom and virtue as much as any, without extracting from the Athenians more than a 20th of their income, and splendidly adorned their city, and carried on their wars and providing sacrifices for temples. For the rest, the city was left in full enjoyment of its existing laws, except that the care was always taken to have some of the families among the archons. In other words, except the care was always taken to have some one of the family among the archons. Among those rivals and relative held each year the archon. In other words, among those rivals that had the yearly archonship in Athens was Pistarus, son of the tyrant Hippias, and named after his grandfather, who, when he was archon, dedicated the altar to the 12 guards in the marketplace, and that of Apollo in the Pythian precinct. The Athenian people all afterwards built on to and lengthened the altar in the marketplace and obliterated the inscription, but that in the Parthian district can still be seen, although in faded letters, in the following effect. Pistius, son of Hippias, set up this record of his archonship in the precinct of Apollo's Prethus. That Hippias was the eldest son and succeeded to the government, his regime, is what I positively assert as a fact upon which I have had more exact accounts than others, and may be also ascertained by the following circumstance. He is the only one of the legitimate brothers that appears to have had children, as the altar shows, and the pillar placed in the Athenian Acropolis, commemorating the crimes of the tyrants, will with mention no child of Thistleus or of Hippocrates, but the five of Hippias, and he had of Miri, who was daughter of Calus, son of Hippocleides, and naturally the eldest would have married first. Again, the name comes from on the pillar after that of his father, and this too is quite natural, as he had an eldest named after him, and the reigning tyrant. Nor can I ever believe that Hippias would ever obtain the tyranny so easily, if Hippocartus had been in power when he was killed. And Hippias, had to establish himself upon the same day. But he, no doubt, had been long accustomed to overawe the citizens, and to be obeyed by his mercenaries, and thus not only conquered, but conquered with ease, without experiencing any of the embarrassment of the younger brothers of a younger brother unused to such a exercise of authority. It was said it was the sad fate which made Hippocrates famous, that he got him also the credit with posterity of having sorry made him famous, that got him also the credit with posterity of having been tyrant. To return to Harmodus, Hippocrates, Hippocrates, having been repulsed in the of his solicitations, insulted him as he had been resolved, but first by in inviting a sister of Harmodinus, a younger girl, to come and bear a basket of a certain possession, and then rejecting her on the grounds that she had never been invited at all owing to her unworthiness. If Harmodius was indignant at this, Aristogon, for his sake, now became more exasperated than ever, and having arranged everything with those who were to join them in the enterprise. They only waited for the great feast of the Panathenaea, the sole day in which the citizens forming part of the possession could meet together in arms without suspicion. Aristogon and Harmodius were uh, 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 um, to begin, but were to be supported immediately by their accomplices against the bodyguards. The conspirators were not many, for better security, besides which they hoped that those not in the plot would be carried away by the example of a few daring spirits, and use the arms at hands to recover their liberty. Um, at last, the festivals arrived, and Hippodamus, with his bodyguards outside the cities and in Camdarus, arranging how the different parts of the procession would be presided. Harmodius and Agamemnon had already in their daggers and were ready to act. Seeing one of their accomplices talking familiar with Hippias, who was easily accessible to everyone, they took fright and concluded that they had been discovered, and were on point of being arrested, and eager, if possible, to be avenged upon the man who had wronged them, and for whom they had undertaken all this risk. They rushed as they were within the gates, and meeting the Hippocrates by the Lacordium, recklessly fell on him at once. Infuriated, Aristogon by love and Harmodius by insult struck him and killed him. Aristogon escaped the guards at the moment, though the crowd running up, but was afterwards taken and executed in no merciful way. Harmodius was killed on the spot. When the news was brought to Hippias at the Kermatus, he at once proceeded not to the scene of the action, but to the armed men in the possession before they, becoming some distance knowing away, knew nothing of the matter, composing his features for the occasion so not to betray himself. He pointed to a certain spot and bade them to assemble there without their arms. They withdrew accordingly and supposed that they had something to say, whereupon he told the mercenaries to remove their arms, and then they were picked out the men he thought guilty, and all who were found with daggers, the shield and spears being used the usual weapon for the possession. In this way, offended love first led Harmodus and Aristogon to conspire. The alarm of the moment to commit the rash action recounted. After this, tyranny pressed harder on the Athenians, and Hippias, now grown more fearful, put to death many of the citizens. At the same time, he began to turn his eye towards abroad for refuge in case of revolution. Thus, although an Athenian, he gave his daughter Archididas to Lampcade, Arintes, son of the tyrant Lampocratos, seeing they had great influence with Darius. And there is her tomb, and there is her tomb in Lampicratus with this inscription: Archidaeus lies beneath the earth, Hippias her sire, and Athens gave her birth. Upon her blossom pride had never known, though through daughter, wife, and sister to the throne. Hippodamus, after reigning 3 years longer than over the Athenians, was disposed in the fourth by the Spartans and banished Alcibiades, and went with a safe conduct to Sigrum and to the Tendes at Lemcratus. From thence to King Darius, from whose court he set out 20 years later, in old age, and came with the Persians to Marathon. Sorry, to Marathon. With these events in mind, and recalling everything they knew by hearsay on the subject, the Athenian people grew uneasy and suspicious of persons charged in the affairs of the mysteries, and came convinced that all that had taken place was part of an oligarchic and monarchical conspiracy. And the state of the agitation thus produced many persons of considerable status had already been thrown into prison. And far from showing any signs of abating, public feeling grew more dangerously savage. More arrests were made until one last of those in custody, thought to be the most guilty of all, was induced by a fellow prisoner to give information, whether true or not is a matter on which there are two opinions, no one having been able, either then or since, to say for certain who did the deed. However, this may be the only found argument to persuade him that even if he had not done it, he ought to have saved himself by gaining the promise of impunity, and freed the city of its present suspicion, as he would be surer of safety if he confessed after promise of impunity than if he denied and were brought to trial. He accordingly made a confession implicating himself and others in the affairs of the Hermae and the Athenian people, glad at the last to get what had supposed was the truth, that they had supposed the truth, and furious until then not being able to discover those who had conspired against the majority. At once let go the informer and all the rest who had not denounced, and bringing the accused to trial, executed as many as were apprehended and condemned to death, such as fled, and set a price on their head. In this, it was, after all, not clear whether the sufferers had been punished unjustly, and in any case, the rest of the city received immediate and manifest relief. To return to Alcibiades, public feeling was very hostile to him, being worked on by the same enemies who had attacked him before he went out. Now the Athenians fancied that they had gotten the truth of the matter of the Hermes, and believed more firmly than ever that the affairs of the mysteries also, in which he was implicated, had been contrived by him in the same intentions, and was connected with the plot against democracy. Meanwhile, it so happened that just at the time of this agitation, a small force of Spartans had advanced as far as Isthmus in pursuance of some scheme of the Boeotians. It was now thought that they had come by prior arrangements at his instigation, and not on account of the Boeotians, and that if the citizen had not acted on the information received and forestalled them by arresting the prisoners, the city would have been betrayed. The citizens went so far as to sleep one night armed in the temple of Theseus within the walls. Also, just as the time the friends of Alcibiades, were suspected of a design to attack the Argive people, so the Argive hostages deposited on the island were given up by the Athenians to the Argive people to be put to death upon that account. In short, everywhere something was found to create suspicions against Alcibiades. It was therefore decided to bring him to trial and execute him, and the Salmonella was sent to Sicily for him, and others named in the information instructed to order him to return to answer the charge against him, but not to arrest him, because they wished to avoid causing any agitation in the army or among the enemies of Sicily, and above all to retain the services of the Magians and Argives, who was thought had been induced to join by his influence. Alcibiades, with his own ships and his fellow accused, accordingly sailed off with the Seminara from Sicily, as though to return to Athens, and went with her as far as the Thergae. And there they left the ship and disappeared, being afraid to go home for trial with such prejudice existing among them. The crew of the Seminila stayed some time looking for Alcibiades and his companions, and at length they were nowhere to be found. Set sail and departed. Alcibiades, now an outlaw, crossed in a boat not long after from Thergae to the Peloponnese, and the Athenians passed sentence of death by default on him and those in his company. The Athenian generals left in Sicily now divided the army in two parts, and each, taken one by lot, sailed with the whole to Salmon and Aegea, wishing to know whether the Aegeans would give the money, and look into the question of Salamis with this, and ascertain the state of the quarrel between her and Aegea, coasting along Sicily with the shore on their left, and on the side towards the Thracian Sea they touched at Hamidia, the only Hellenistic city in the part of the island, and being refused admission, resumed their voyage. On their way in that part of the island, and being on their way, they took Heraclea, pretty, Sicilian seaport, nevertheless at war with Aegea, and making slaves of its inhabitants, gave the city to the Aegeans, some of whose horse had joined them. After which the army proceeded into the territory of the Sicils until it reached Cantina, while the fleet sailed along the coast with the slaves on board. Meanwhile, Nicias sailed straight from Hecrea along the coast and went to Agria, and after transiting his other business, received 30 talents, rejoined their forces. They now sold their slaves for the sum of 120 talents, and sailed round to the Sicil allies to urge them to send troops. Meanwhile, some with half of their forces to the hostile city of Heprea in the territory of Lee, but did not succeed in taking it. And this ends the summer. Okay, this ends the summer in 62. So we'll stop here with the second part. This ends the second part. If you have any comments or questions, please make them here. I will reply to them when I see them. I'll answer them the best I can. If you have any suggestions, please make them. If you like what you've seen here, like, and if you want more, don't like, okay, of course you can say no, you don't like it. There's nothing wrong with that. I keep I don't turn off this on button. If you want to subscribe, if I see more of this, subscribe, tell friends about this. You can follow me on social media below. If you want to help, if you want to help me continue these things, and a little bit of assistance, you can do it as a patron, either in Patreon or Subscribe Star. Just this is something small, so that helps fund the things, do things. Otherwise, I will say goodbye today, and see you next time. Have a good day. Bye bye.